Good afternoon. My name is Myron Frans. I'm the Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget. And as a Commissioner, I'm the state's Chief Financial Officer. And today, I'm here with the state economist, Dr. Laura Klumbakidis, and the state budget director, Britta Rayton, to present an updated budget for your review and consideration. Before I begin, if you're listening online, you can go to mn.gov/MMB, and you can find this presentation that's loaded there. A little more than 2 months ago, we released our February forecast. Our economy looked like it was in good shape. The U.S. economic outlook remained stable, and Minnesota had a projected surplus of more than $1.5 billion for this biennium with low unemployment. In her remarks last February, Dr. Klumbakidis said that one of the forecast risks was the prolonged and widespread virus outbreak, referring to the coronavirus. Well, since February, economic conditions have dramatically weakened. Our economic outlook remains volatile due to the coronavirus. Last month, Governor Walz requested an updated budget projection that takes into account the extraordinary situation so that he and the legislature can have the most up-to-date information as they finish the legislative session on May 18th and make decisions about the state budget. Today's updated budget projection is based on the new U.S. economic data from our consultants, IHS Markit, and the current biennium for fiscal years 2020 and 2021. We have updated the largest general fund revenue sources that Dr. Klumbakidis will talk about, and we've also updated some of the spending items that Britta Rayton, the budget director, will talk about. We have also included money that has been appropriated during this legislative session specifically to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Based on current economic conditions, we now project a $2.426 billion deficit for the current biennium, fiscal years 2020 and 2021. This is almost a $4 billion change since the February forecast. I want to be clear, the deficit of $2.4 billion is before any use of the state's budget reserve. But before I turn it over to Dr. Klumbakidis, I just want to mention, as people around the state know, that over the last 9 years, we have worked consistently to build our budget reserve to its current level. Later in this presentation, I'll talk more about the budget tools available to the governor and the legislature, but now I'll turn it over to Dr. Klumbakidis.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll start by presenting the U.S. outlook, move to Minnesota's economy, and then present our new revenue projection. The outbreak of COVID-19 and the measures taken to prevent its spread have dramatically weakened the outlook for U.S. growth since we released our forecast in February. IHS is now forecasting a three-quarter recession, resulting in a 5.4% decline in real GDP in 2020. In contrast, in February, they had forecast 2.1% growth for this year. Consumer spending, which accounts for two-thirds of U.S. GDP, has been hit hard by the pandemic crisis. Temporary business closures, social distancing measures, volatile financial markets, rising unemployment, and declining wage income contribute to a forecast 5.5% decline in real consumer spending this year. So the first chart shows the level of real GDP. The solid line shows the history and IHS's April outlook, which informs today's projection. The dotted line shows their February outlook. In the dramatic dip in the solid line, you can see 3/4 of declining GDP this year. IHS notes that their outlook depends critically on the path of the pandemic. They expect the spread of COVID-19 to peak and then dissipate in early summer, allowing social distancing restrictions to be lifted during late summer or early fall. Economic recovery begins then, and real GDP growth turns positive toward the end of the year. Real GDP is forecast to grow 6.3% in 2021. You can see from the graph that IHS expects GDP to reach its pre-pandemic level in mid-21, but within our projection horizon, GDP does not get back to where it would have been without the pandemic. We never get back to that dotted line. Some amount of economic activity is simply lost. I could show you graphs like this for other variables, for instance, for consumer spending, which informs our sales tax forecast, or for total wage income, which informs our income tax projection. And the pictures would all be the same. A deep plunge this year, followed by growth next year, but never reaching the path that we had been on. The shock to the U.S. economy from the pandemic is unprecedented in modern post-war history, and the economic outlook is exceptionally uncertain and volatile. Economic outcomes will depend critically on the pandemic's course, the prospects for an effective treatment and vaccine, government restrictions on activity, consumers and businesses' responses as those restrictions are lifted, and the impact of fiscal and monetary policies. The U.S. economic outlook will remain volatile and uncertain for some time. Let me turn to Minnesota's outlook. Minnesota entered the COVID-19 crisis with a high demand for labor, low unemployment, and job growth that had slowed to below the U.S. rate amid a limited supply of workers. The disease outbreak, the restrictions applied to slow its spread, and the U.S. and global economic contractions have rocked Minnesota's economy, and generated conditions that will remain volatile as long as the pandemic persists and as long as the U.S. outlook remains uncertain. Now, official economic data lag our observations about economic activity that we see as we go around our daily lives, making it difficult to precisely measure how the COVID-19 crisis has already impacted the state. However, one frequently published statistic that reflects the labor market is the number of people who have filed initial claims for unemployment benefits. According to DEED, since mid-March, an unprecedented 600,000 Minnesotans have applied for benefits, indicating a dramatic increase in layoffs by the state's employers. So in this chart, we show the annual growth rate in total Minnesota wage and salary income. So that variable is the sum of all the payrolls of all the employers of the entire state, and the height of the bars shows the annual growth rate in that variable. The dark bars show the history, and then the striped bars show our new projection. As employers reduce hours, cut pay, and lay off and furlough workers, we estimate that total Minnesota wage and salary income will decline 5.9% this year. We now expect wage income to grow 0.3% in 21, but not reach its pre-pandemic level until 22. Turning to the new revenue projection, total general fund revenues for the current biennium are now projected to be $3.611 billion less than the February 2020 forecast. The estimates for all major tax types have been reduced. Individual income tax receipts are now projected to be $1.659 billion less than the February forecast. The decrease is primarily due to that projected decline in wage income I just showed, as well as declines in non-wage income, including business income and capital gains. Sales tax revenue is now projected to be $1.351 billion less than the prior forecast, and that lower projection is consistent with the lower forecast in consumer spending that I talked about earlier. The corporate tax is projected to generate $405 million less than the prior forecast, based on a lower forecast for corporate profits. Finally, let me reiterate some of the many risks in this forecast. Related to the path of the pandemic is the path of consumer and business confidence. Some businesses that have temporarily closed or seen declines in revenues are facing significant uncertainty about reopening or even survival. And it is not clear when consumers will have the means and the trust in public safety to get back to spending. Increased financial market volatility can hinder consumer spending by lowering household wealth. The impact of federal fiscal and monetary policy, while it is incorporated into the U.S. outlook that we used, the impact is still uncertain, as is the extent of additional federal financial support to state and local governments. Delays in Minnesota tax payments that have been allowed during the crisis also delay the signals about the economy that we normally use to inform our projections. The revenue picture will be clear to us later in the summer. And finally, with 14 months remaining until the end of the biennium, even small changes in the growth rates of some important revenue sources can have big changes in the outlook for this biennium and the next. I'll now turn it over to State Budget Director Britta Rayton.
Good afternoon. I'm going to walk quickly through the expenditure side of this budget projection. Overall, projected spending is up $391 million relative to our previous projection in February. This change has two parts: the spending enacted by the legislature since the February forecast, and the projected changes in spending due to reestimates as part of this interim budget projection. First, the legislature enacted and the governor signed into law $550 million in increased general fund spending so far this session. This spending is almost entirely dedicated to the COVID-19 response. Over the coming weeks, some of this spending may be redirected to federal resources provided to Minnesota either through the CARES Act or reimbursed through FEMA. So the general fund impact of that spending may be reduced, but this estimate reflects current law, which directs the spending from the general fund. The second component of the overall change is an updated budget projection for Health and Human Services spending. This update is shown in the projection change column and shows a decline in anticipated state spending since February of $160 million. The only bill area we re-estimated spending projections for since February is the Health and Human Services area. This is because Health and Human Services spending tends to be more variable based on economic conditions, and the spending is counter-cyclical to the economy, as participation in public programs tends to increase during economic downturns. The underlying economic data does drive increased participation projections in this estimate, particularly in fiscal year 21. This participation change drives increased cost estimates of $164 million. However, these costs are more than offset by additional federal funding for the medical assistance program since the February forecast. Congress passed an increase to the federal match for states in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. The expected growth in federal funding is $330 million. This increased federal funding reduces state expenditures in that program and more than offsets the increased costs due to the growth in participation in public programs. Combined, this results in a reduction in the spending projection of $160 million relative to February. And when that projection change is added to the legislatively enacted changes since February, we see the increase of $391 million. As I mentioned before, we did not provide updated estimates for the other bill areas with this projection. The only changes you see here in other bill areas are due to the changes enacted by the legislature to date during this session. So turning to the next slide. This slide brings together the revenue and expenditure sides of the budget projection. As Dr. Kolumbakidis explained, the revenue projection is down $3.611 billion compared to previous estimates. And as I just walked through, the spending estimate is up $391 million compared to February. There is also a change in our reserves, but it's in the stadium reserve, and this estimate has decreased by $63 million, leaving $66 million in that reserve in this projection. This is due to a dramatically reduced amount of charitable gambling revenues compared to our February projections. The changes overall results in a projected deficit in fiscal years 20 and 21 of $2.426 billion. And now I will pass it back to Commissioner Frans.
Thank you, Budget Director Rayton and State Economist Laura Kolumbakidis. So, sound fiscal management is what we've been talking about for years. And when you do sound fiscal management, you consistently plan for 4 years, not just 2 years. You ensure that the state revenues grow faster than state spending. And whenever the state has a surplus in November, you take 1/3 of that surplus and put it into the state budget reserve. Our budget reserve is now $2.359 billion. Thank you to Governor Dayton, Governor Walz, and the Minnesota legislature who all worked together to build our state budget reserve. There is a reason we call the budget reserve and the cash account, which is another $350 million. There's a reason we call that a rainy day fund. It's for a rainy day. And well, today is a rainy day, unfortunately. Now is the time to use some of our $2.3 billion rainy day fund to help Minnesota weather this severe economic downturn and give policymakers, the governor and the legislature, time to consider options to maintain critical services and support growing needs in the face of declining revenues. With this projected budget deficit, the governor has the legal authority to use the reserve to restore budget balance. We need to be cautious, targeted, and focus on the choices that we make to balance our biennial budget. In the coming weeks and months, the governor and lawmakers must also examine our revenue and cost structures to rebalance the budget. Some people have asked about the use of unallotment. This is the budget tool where appropriations under current law can be canceled or reduced. Unallotment can be used by the governor only after the budget reserve has been fully depleted. I also want to caution against relying solely on the reserve to close this budget gap. Depleting these funds in this current situation is difficult because we know revenues are going to continue to decline during the remaining 14 months. And there are many factors with a high degree of uncertainty about today's budget projection. While we design budget changes for this biennium, we do need to recognize the budget reality, and that is we have decided to wait for information about the next 2 years, 22 and 23, to wait for more additional information. But we've learned during the Great Recession that this recession now will have effects on the next biennium. I want to show just a little bit about the complexity of this situation we're dealing with. We have federal streams of dollars for response, state streams of dollars, and also local businesses and philanthropy. Minnesota has already received federal funding of about $2.18 billion from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. We have also received some grants from the government for direct programs like K through 12 programs, higher education, transit, and others. Individuals and businesses are receiving grants and direct payments through both the federal government and state government. Minnesota, along with all the states across the nation, will need additional funds from the federal government to help balance our budgets as revenues continue to decrease and spending increases to save lives and to slow the virus's spread. At our state level, Governor Walz and the legislature have already provided $550 million in investments to respond to this crisis, including for public health, healthcare providers, child care, housing supports, and small businesses. To reduce state spending, some of the federal funds that I mentioned will be used to reimburse some state spending. Private donors have also stepped up, and the Minnesota Disaster Recovery Fund, we have seen contributions of over $11 million to help address the most urgent needs. We're in a difficult time, but we will get through this together with government, business, nonprofits, individuals, and philanthropy working together, each contributing in their own way. The good news is Minnesota has managed our state budget well. We have made smart decisions and preparations for an economic downturn. We never anticipated it would be a downturn based on a global pandemic, but our rainy day fund now is at the highest level in our state's history. I understand that these decisions will not be easy, and many difficult decisions lie ahead. But we've entered this crisis with some budget tools to manage, and Minnesota can count on us to use thoughtful and smart decisions about how to rebalance this budget. During the last weeks of this legislative session, I will remind policymakers in the legislature that we do not need to solve all of our budget problems by May 18th. Both the economic and pandemic situations are constantly changing, and it is likely we will need to adjust this budget several times throughout the course of the remaining biennium. We should not overreact or underreact. We need to continue being focused, targeted, and strategic in our response.